Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we cut through the noise, stack up the research, and give you the absolute blueprint of what's truly important in science, history, and thought.
And today, we are going really deep. We're talking about the one subject that defines literally every single thing you do, think, and remember.
We're talking about the physical architecture of learning.
Yeah, and this isn't just some dusty academic history lesson. We are tracing the origins of a single, incredibly powerful and, elegant rule that is the foundational operating system for both your brain and for modern artificial intelligence.
That's exactly right. If you've ever wondered how information turns into physical, how a fleeting electrical signal becomes a permanent structural change inside your skull, you need to understand Donald Hebb.
His work, which gets bundled under the term Hebb Synapse, basically provides the answer.
So, for you listening right now, our mission is to peel back the layers on this deceptively simple idea.
We want to understand the concept that connects psychology, memory, and the brain's physical wiring. And at the end of the day, it explains a kind of miracle.
Which is?
How you can think about a giant, gray, muddy elephant right now without needing an actual elephant to be in the room with you.
Okay, I love that. So let's start this deep dive not in some clean, sterile lab full of diagrams, but somewhere much darker.
More like a psychological thriller.
Exactly. To understand this beautiful theory of learning, we first have to talk about a really shocking, high-stakes series of experiments from the early 1950s.
Experiments that literally tried to break the human mind.
Imagine the atmosphere. It's around 1951.
Oh, the tension is sky high. The Cold War is in full swing. The Korean War is raging.
And there is this palpable, overwhelming public fear about one thing: brainwashing.
Right. Western governments were completely terrified that the Soviets or Communist China had discovered some kind of secret psychological technique to, totally re-engineer the minds of captured soldiers.
It was a very real, very high-stakes fear. The official story was that all these confessions coming out of the Eastern Bloc were proof of some profound, new vulnerability in the human mind.
And this is where Donald Hebb, working up at McGill University in Montreal, finds himself right in the middle of it all.
He gets funding, right?
He does. He secures funding from the Defense Research Board of Canada, and our sources confirm there was coordination with agencies like the CIA to figure out how to resist this stuff.
Or how to develop it.
Yeah. Effective interrogation and resistance techniques.
Wait, hold on a second. You're telling me the man who dedicated his life to defining the precise physical blueprint for how the brain builds itself through experience,
how it learns, how it wires new concepts,
was also working with defense and intelligence agencies to figure out how to deconstruct or break the brain.
That is the chilling irony. It just perfectly captures the paranoia of the early 1950s.
Wow. Okay, so what was his focus?
He focused on something called perceptual isolation. He wanted to know what happens when you systematically deprive an organized mind of almost all sensory input.
So what did those experiments actually look like? You can't just switch someone's senses off.
No, but you can get close. The conditions were pretty extreme. They were designed to minimize light, sound, and touch as much as humanly possible.
And he used student volunteers for this?
Yep. Paid them generously, which, tends to attract people willing to put up with a lot.
Mm-hmm.
They were kept in small, soundproof chambers. Some had translucent goggles, so all they could see was this diffuse, formless light.
And for touch.
They wore these thick cardboard cuffs and gloves to minimize any kind of tactile sensation.
You're basically trying to create a sensory void. What happened to the students?
Well, a lot of them quit pretty quickly. The physical conditions were just unbearable. But the ones who stuck it out, they reported an almost total inability to concentrate.
Their thinking just fell apart.
Totally disorganized. They suffered severe emotional distress, and here's the most disturbing part. They began to hallucinate.
No way.
Yeah, and not just visually, across all senses.
So their brains just started making stuff up, manufacturing its own sensory data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They reported seeing specific patterns, like dots or lines, hearing conversations that weren't happening, feeling phantom sensations on their skin.
That's incredible. It demonstrates fundamentally that the mind isn't just a passive computer waiting for you to type something in.
Not at all. When that input stream stops, the internal engine just runs wild. It starts scrambling to find the information it needs to organize itself, and when it can't find it, it invents it.
So Hebb himself later admitted the main reason for the research was this fear of brainwashing. He needed to figure out, and I think this is a quote, what happens when you stop the flow of information that organizes the self?
And the chilling insight is that the self, the mind, it rapidly breaks down without that constant, varied stimulation.
This has to connect to his larger theory, right?
Absolutely. This is the negative proof of the Hebbian theory, which was still forming at the time. If these cell assemblies, we'll get to those later, but think of them as stable concepts in your brain, are built and maintained by the world,
By constant firing and refiring driven by experience.
then taking the world away causes those assemblies to just disintegrate. They start to misfire. The brain starts seeing elephants that aren't there because the internal structure has no external feedback to keep it stable.
The architecture is starved. It's just scrambling for any input it can get to maintain its own integrity.
And you can connect this to the broader context of all his work, which was the massive, massive impact of early experience. Hebb's whole idea was that the environment literally shapes the individual brain.
The sensory deprivation experiments just showed what happens when you take the sculptor away.
Right. And on the flip side of that coin, you have all these studies showing what happens when the environment is richly provided, like that famous developmental work by Hart and Risley.
Ah, yes, the 30 million word gap.
Exactly. A long-term study that tracked kids and their families, looking at language exposure in early life. And they found this massive difference in vocabulary and learning rates, often tied to socioeconomic status.
Kids from lower-income families sometimes heard millions, literally millions fewer words by the time they were 3.
And it's not just the volume. It's the richness, the complexity of that early verbal stimulation. It dictates the neurological starting line for a person. It suggests the environment isn't just offering you information, it's literally providing the raw material for your neural networks to fire and wire and connect into a coherent structure.
So you have these two extreme proof points for Hebb's big idea. Too much rich input early on builds these super complex, efficient systems.
The Hart and Risley kids.
And taking that input away later on causes those same systems to collapse into chaotic hallucination.
The environment is the ultimate sculptor. But the scientific question Hebb had to answer was, how? How does the chaotic noise of the world outside become the highly ordered structural memory inside our heads?
To answer that, he had to take on the villain of his story, outdated science.
Before Hebb published his big book, The Organization of Behavior, in 1949, the scientific community, they were operating with a really limited view of the brain. They were stuck.
A massive scientific impasse.
The dominant model was the Pavlovian one. Stimulus response, or SR.
The passive switchboard analogy, right. Input comes in, a switch is flipped, output goes out.
Exactly. The brain as a telephone switchboard. The assumption was that the neural pathway was a direct, fixed, one-way street. A bell rings, the signal travels along a wire, flips a switch, and causes salivation.
And crucially, the wire itself was considered passive. It didn't add anything to the signal, it just conducted it.
That sounds so brittle. So fragile. If that one wire breaks, the whole connection is just gone forever.
It is. And it totally fails to account for things like attention or memory. If I remember something that isn't being stimulated right now, where did that come from? The model has no answer.
And it immediately ran into some huge biological problems that Hebb was determined to solve.
The first one was intrinsic activity. We have to go back to 1929 to Hans Berger.
Berger and the EEG, the electroencephalogram. He was the first to realize the brain wasn't just silent, waiting for a call. It was humming, buzzing, crackling with its own persistent, intrinsic electrical energy.
Even when you were asleep.
Even when you were asleep or just chilling out. This completely destroys the passive switchboard model.
Of course. If the brain is already active, if there's already an internal party going on before the bell even rings, then a simple stimulus response theory is just totally inadequate.
Hebb said it himself. The EEG data proved that the physiological data that behaviorism was relying on was either wrong or, just woefully incomplete. He knew that if your theory can't even explain something as basic as focused attention, your theory is broken.
Okay, so that's problem number one. What was the second, maybe even bigger, failure of the old theories?
The problem of perceptual generalization.
This is the one where we realized the brain would need an impossible amount of hard drive space under the old model.
Let's use an example. Recognizing a chair.
Okay, I see a chair, I recognize it instantly. I have a memory trace and enneagram for chair.
Right. But you can recognize that same chair if you see it from the side.
Yeah.
Or from above.
Yeah.
Or if it's painted red.
Yeah.
Or if it's tiny and far away. Or if it's just a stick figure drawing of a chair.
Every single time the image changes, the light is hitting a completely different set of sensory receptors in my eye.
Exactly. And under the old SR model, if the brain had to store a separate fixed memory trace for every single possible version of that chair. Chair from the front, chair from the side. You would need an astronomical number of neurons.
The brain would run out of physical space by lunchtime.
Totally. So the huge challenge was finding a theory that explained how the same underlying concept, the chairness of the chair, could be recognized despite wildly different sensory inputs.
How did people try to solve this before Hebb came along?
There were two main camps, basically.
Yeah.
And Hebb argued that both of them failed to bridge that gap between the mind and the body.
First up, you had Gestalt theory.
The Gestaltists were all about perception. They argued that a sensory input creates a field in the brain, maybe a dynamic electrical field, whose shape only depended on the overall pattern of the stimulus, not where it hit your retina. A circle is a circle, no matter where you see it.
Okay, that sounds pretty elegant psychologically. It solves the recognition problem, so what was the flaw?
It had zero physiological plausibility. It explained what happened, but not how. When you asked them how the brain actually stored that abstract field as a memory, they had no biological mechanism to offer.
So their answer was basically, it happens in the mind, an exit ramp to philosophy.
Pretty much. So Gestalt theory was great at perception, but terrible at memory and learning.
And on the other side, you had the behaviorists.
Behaviorism, with guys like Pavlov and Skinner, was amazing at explaining learning, habit formation, conditioning associations, but they intentionally ignored the brain itself.
The famous black box.
They didn't care what was in the black box. So they couldn't explain how the physical pattern hitting all those different sensory receptors could reliably find its way to the same learned structure every time.
It's like having a perfect theory for how to drive a car, but having zero idea how an engine actually works.
That's a great way to put it. And Hebb saw this impasse. He knew a complete theory had to reconcile three things: the stability of memory, the generalization of perception, and the instabilities of attention. That constant active hum of the brain.
So he set out to build a comprehensive, integrated neuropsychological theory, one based on how actual nerve cells worked.
An almost impossible quest, especially given the limited tools they had back in the 30s and 40s.
But it was an incredible journey. He spent nearly 2 decades refining his ideas, and his final theory was really a synthesis, borrowing key pieces from the giants he worked with.
First up, his PhD was with Carl Lashley, who was famous for his very frustrating search for the memory trace.
The enneagram.
Right. Lashley would train rats to run mazes and then systematically cut out different parts of their cortex to see if he could find and remove the memory.
And he never could he? The memory seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once.
Exactly. No matter where he cut, the memory of the maze persisted, even if the rat's performance got a bit worse. Lashley's big conclusion, which Hebb took to heart, was that memory wasn't localized.
It depended on the mass functioning of many neurons. It was distributed.
That told Hebb right away that any successful theory had to be about networks, not single, fixed telephone wires.
So lesson 1, memory is a distributed network. Then he moves to the clinical world to work with Wilder Penfield in Montreal.
And this is where he sees the human side of it. Penfield was famous for mapping the brain in awake patients during epilepsy surgery. He'd stimulate parts of the cortex with an electrode and see what happened.
Hebb's big observation there was that you could remove huge portions of the frontal cortex, and it often had surprisingly little effect on the patient's intelligence.
Which just hammered home that idea of distributed function he got from Lashley. Memory is spread out, it's resilient, it's not dependent on one little pristine spot in the brain.
Okay, so he's got the, what, a distributed network, but he still needs the how. How does this network sustain its own activity? And more importantly, how does it physically change with experience?
This was the big problem. Hebb knew the current physiological data couldn't explain how internal thought could even happen. If the SR model was right, your brain should go silent the second a stimulus disappears.
But it doesn't. We can think about lunch long after we've seen the sandwich.
That persistence implies some kind of continuous internal electrical activity. He needed a mechanism that allowed activity to, as he put it, reverberates persistently to keep the momentum going.
And he found it in the work of a Spanish neuroanatomist, Rafael Lorente de No.
A brilliant scientist who did these incredibly detailed microscopic studies of nerve fibers. And he found something revolutionary.
He found that nerve fibers could form closed chains.
Recurrent loops.
This was the game changer.
A total game changer. Before this, everyone assumed it was a one-way street. Neuron A fires neuron B, and the signal moves on and dissipates in milliseconds. Lorente de No showed that the axon from the last neuron in a chain could actually loop back and excite the first neuron in that same chain.
Creating a self-sustaining cycle.
Yes. Let's use an analogy for this because it's the key to understanding internal thought. The old model is like a relay race.
Right. Runner 1 passes the baton to runner 2, who passes it to runner 3, who crosses the finish line. The energy stops. The race is over.
That's the old SR path. The recurrent loop is totally different. It's like a circular, self-perpetuating game of hot potato.
Okay.
The initial the stimulus starts the activity, but the players, the neurons, are arranged in a circle. Player 4 immediately throws it back to player 1, and the activity can just keep looping, reverberating pretty much indefinitely.
The energy is contained, recycling itself.
And that persistence of activity is the physiological basis for attention and short-term memory. It's the mechanism that lets you hold a phone number in your mind for 30 seconds without saying it out loud.
The circuit is literally sustaining itself.
Which is why Hebb could finally say, you need not have an elephant present to think about elephants. The elephant thought is just the activity reverberating in that closed circuit. The concept is active and sustaining itself internally.
But wait a second, if these circuits are constantly sustaining themselves, doesn't that cost a ton of energy?
That's a fantastic point. It does. The brain is only about 2% of your body weight, but it uses over 20% of your total energy. A huge chunk of that goes to sustaining this basal intrinsic activity.
So the loops are the mechanism for consciousness, but they come at a high metabolic price.
They absolutely do. So Hebb now has the distributed network from Lashley and Penfield, and he has the internal persistence mechanism from Laurent-Deneau.
But the loops only explain short-term thought, the active hot potato game. They don't explain long-term memory, the permanent storage.
Exactly. The loops explain the activity, but Hebb needed the glue. He needed a rule that explained how repeatedly playing that temporary hot potato game could permanently and physically change the wiring itself.
How the internal basketball dribble could dig a permanent groove in the floor.
And after all those years of piecing it together, he delivered that rule. In 1949, in The Organization of Behavior, he laid out the foundational postulate that changed neuroscience forever.
Let's hear the original quote. It's a little dense, but it's just magnificent.
Okay, he wrote. Let us assume that the persistence or repetition of a reverberatory activity tends to induce lasting cellular changes that add to its stability. And here's the key part. When an axon of cell A is near enough to excite a cell B and repeatedly or persistently takes part in firing it, some growth process or metabolic change takes place in one or both cells, such that A's efficiency, as one of the cells firing B, is increased.
That's the moment. He connected the short-term electrical repetition to a long-term physical change.
The definition of brain plasticity. And it all gets summarized by that beautiful phrase that basically launched the field of neurocomputing.
Neurons that fire together wire together.
That's the one.
Okay, let's ground this with an analogy. You said we could use food. Let's go back to neuron A being hot water and neuron B being instant noodles.
Perfect. So, initially, the connection between the hot water and the noodles might be weak. A leaky faucet, maybe? Neuron A fires, but neuron B might not fire. There's no reliable link.
But if neuron A consistently fires, and that firing consistently causes neuron B to fire, if A reliably predicts B,
the system sees that correlation and rewards it with a physical change. The leaky faucet, neuron A, remodels its plumbing to become a wide, efficient fire hose that dumps a huge amount of stimulus onto neuron B. The connection strength, the synaptic weight, is permanently increased.
So it's not just an electrical thing. Hebb is saying there's a permanent structural growth.
He is. And this rule establishes prediction and causality as the drivers of learning. If the first neuron consistently predicts the second one's firing, the connection gets stronger. If it consistently fails, the connection gets weaker.
Use it or lose it.
The ultimate use it or lose it principle. And this simple local rule allowed Hebb to define the physical structure of a complex idea. He called it the cell assembly.
So the cell assembly is the result of this wiring process, a big group of interconnected neurons that are so strongly wired together that they tend to fire as a single functional unit.
It's the stable, structural representation of a concept, the idea of chair or circle. And because it's a distributed network, it solves Lashley's problem of where memory is stored.
And because it's self-exciting with those recurrent loops, you can hold the concept in your mind without the actual chair being there.
And it solves the problem of perceptual generalization, too. If you see a tiny circle or a giant circle, they hit different parts of your retina. But because the underlying cell assembly for circleness has such strong internal connections, that partial activation is enough to trigger the whole thing.
It recognizes the pattern without needing a fixed location. That's so elegant.
It is. But thoughts aren't just single ideas, they're sequences. How did Hebb explain a complex thought process, like planning a road trip.
He called it the phase sequence. This is how the individual cell assemblies link together over time.
Okay, so using the road trip analogy, one cell assembly is the concept car, another is gas station, a third is destination.
The phase sequence is the thought process that links them. I need to get in the car. Assembly 1 fires, which makes me think about driving to the gas station. Assembly 2 is triggered to make sure I can reach my destination. Assembly 3 is triggered.
The firing of one assembly reliably leads to the firing of the next in the chain because your past experiences have strengthened the connections between them.
It's the neural basis for complex thought and behavior.
And it also explains what Hebb called the instabilities of attention. Our focus shifts because the moment one cell assembly fires, it's already starting to excite the next one in the sequence, naturally pushing our thoughts forward.
So Hebb took the fleeting electrical fire of the mind and gave us a single physics-based rule for how that fire could permanently recast the physical structure of the brain. He showed us how experience becomes you.
The influence of this is just staggering. And what's even crazier is that he developed this whole framework based on a flawed assumption. He thought most synapses were electrical.
Right. He was writing before we really knew for sure that the central nervous system ran on chemical neurotransmission.
But the discovery that most synapses are chemical, not electrical, it didn't invalidate his logic at all. His intuition about how connections should change based on correlated activity was profoundly correct.
And decades later, scientists found the undeniable biological proof.
Long-term potentiation, or LTP, and its opposite, long-term depression, LTD.
LTP is the lasting increase in synaptic strength after high-frequency stimulation. It's the physical wiring together that Hebb predicted.
And LTD is the lasting decrease, the use-it-or-lose-it pruning that happens when a connection stops being useful. These are the physical, molecular manifestations of Hebb's growth process.
Okay, so let's get into that. What is the modern molecular mechanism that actually makes a synapse stronger? How does one neuron learn to shout louder at the next one?
It mostly comes down to a special kind of chemical receptor at the synapse called the NMDA receptor.
The NMDA receptor acts like a coincidence detector, right?
That is the perfect way to describe it. It's like a gate that needs 2 keys to open. First, the presynaptic neuron A has to release its neurotransmitter. Second, the postsynaptic neuron B has to already be firing or be depolarized.
So both sides have to be active together, fire together.
When those 2 conditions are met, the NMDA gate swings open and allows a flood of calcium ions into the second cell.
Ah, so calcium's the architect?
Calcium is the internal signal that shouts, hey, this connection is important, remodel it. That calcium influx triggers a whole cascade of biochemical changes. It can cause more receptors to be inserted into the membrane, making it more sensitive, and it can even trigger physical growth, literally making the synapse bigger.
The connection becomes stronger, faster, more efficient, permanently. That's LTP. That's the physical trace of a memory.
It's incredible. Hebb's intuition about a growth process was dead on, even without the chemical playbook.
But modern science didn't just confirm Hebb, it refined his rule.
Which brings us to the modern update. Spike timing dependent plasticity, or STDP.
STDP adds the crucial element of time, down to the millisecond. It's about who caused whom.
Precisely. For a connection to strengthen, for LTP to happen, the presynaptic spike from neuron A has to arrive and fire just before the postsynaptic spike in neuron B, usually within about 10 to 30 milliseconds.
Because that timing reinforces the idea that A caused B to fire.
ETA confirms the causal prediction. A successfully fired B, so let's strengthen that link.
But what happens if the order is reversed? What if B fires before A arrives?
Scientists measured this with unbelievably precise techniques, and they found that if B fires first, the connection actually gets weaker. You get LTD.
Why would that be?
Because the brain interprets that timing as A was irrelevant, B was going to fire anyway, so A's signal was useless. It failed the prediction test.
So the brain conserves energy and prunes that connection. Wow.
The brain is constantly running this incredibly sophisticated analysis of causality and efficiency right down to the millisecond.
That microscopic timing is the difference between learning a new skill and forgetting it. And this is where biology hands the blueprint over to computation.
Exactly. The sheer elegance and simplicity of Hebb's rule, if 2 things happen together, strengthen the link, makes it perfectly translatable into a mathematical algorithm. This is the birth of neurocomputing and modern AI.
We have to talk about Frank Rosenblatt and the Perceptron.
Rosenblatt was directly inspired by Hebb. He realized you could build a machine that learns patterns if you could adjust the weights of its connections based on success.
Hmm.
The perceptron used Hebb's rule as its core learning algorithm.
So if the network successfully recognized a pattern, if its virtual neurons fired together correctly, the weight of that successful connection was mathematically increased.
It was basically a digital cell assembly. It was the original blueprint for computational systems that learn through association. And while modern deep learning uses much more complex methods, they all still rely on the fundamental concept Hebb introduced. Learning happens by changing the efficiency of the connections.
And his legacy goes even deeper into developmental psychobiology. It's the basis for our whole understanding of neuroplasticity. The use it or lose it rule is brutally efficient.
Think about critical periods in development. If a child doesn't get the right visual input during a certain window of time, the neural connections for sight will be pruned and repurposed. The connections that aren't tested don't survive. The brain is constantly optimizing itself for the world it actually lives in.
So from the molecules at the synapse to the architecture of AI to the development of the self, Hebb's simple rule holds true. Experience is constantly physically rewriting the structure of who you are. The brain is never static.
He took the messy, distributed, always-on nature of the brain, the stuff that stumped the old models, and gave us a simple physics-based rule that explained how thought, perception, and memory could all emerge from the self-organized firing of individual cells.
He showed us that the complex programs running our behavior aren't written by some central command. They emerge from simple, local rules. When you learn, you are physically changing the structure of yourself.
It's a remarkable idea, and it leaves us with one final thought, tying Hebb's law directly back to your daily life.
If every repeated thought, every emotional reaction, every single habit reinforces a highly efficient neural groove, a cell assembly, or a phase sequence that directs your behavior, how conscious are you of the grooves you're digging right now?
These grooves, whether they're for productive habits or destructive anxieties, are just synapses that have become incredibly good at firing together. So if those deeply worn patterns are leading you to places you don't want to be, can you really blame the external world?
Or do you have to focus on consciously changing the input, on disrupting the internal wiring that has simply become too efficient at doing the wrong job?
The architecture of your mind is dynamic. It's constantly being rewritten by what fires together.
Choose your attention wisely. Until the next deep dive.
Keep digging.